would be 11, including those of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. The states who commissioned the removed statues would be able to reclaim them if they paid for their transportation back to their home states. And finally, removed statues who are not reclaimed by states would be turned over to the Smithsonian Institute. Now, that's a lot to throw at senators in their first 10 minutes of office. Granted. Fortunately, before senators have to vote on a bill, there's usually a floor debate in which senators share their thoughts and shed light on the potential benefits and harm of a piece of legislation. We're going to hear some prepared statements from senators who have been thinking carefully and studying this bill, and then we're going to open it up to you, our senators in training. You'll notice as these senators debate, they don't address each other, but rather deliver their remarks to the presiding officer, who is called Mr., or in this case, Madam President. And when a senator does make reference to another senator, it's usually in the third person. So instead of saying, you said this, I would say perhaps, the senator from Massachusetts said, or my colleague from Massachusetts said, or perhaps if I particularly disagreed with you, my esteemed colleague from Massachusetts said. This is a way to show respect and keep debate from getting personal. Feel free to adopt this etiquette yourselves should you decide to join the debate. The floor is now open for prepared statements on this bill. The chair recognizes the senator from New Jersey.
Thank you, Madam President. The National Statuary Hall Collection is intended to honor American patriots who served, sacrificed, or made tremendous contributions to our nation. For instance, my state is proud to be represented by statues of Richard Stockton, one of the signers of Declaration of Independence, and General Philip Kearny, who died fighting to preserve the Union during the Civil War. Those who committed treason against the United States and led our nation into its most painful and bloody war, men like Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, are not patriots and should not be afforded such a rare honor in this sacred space. The Capitol is a place for all Americans to come and feel welcomed, encouraged, and inspired. Confederate statues do not do this. They do the opposite. To millions of Americans, they are painful, injurious symbols of bigotry and hate, celebrating individuals who sought to break our nation apart and preserve the vile institution of slavery. These Confederate statues belong in a museum where they can be presented with the proper historical context not venerated in the U.S. Capitol. This is why this bill would turn over any unclaimed statues removed from the Capitol to the Smithsonian, which would preserve and present them with the necessary and appropriate context. Though we've made tremendous progress as a nation in our quest for social, racial, and economic justice, we cannot ignore or forget that Confederates fought fervently to preserve the institution of slavery and keep African Americans in chains. This much is clearly demonstrated by several of the declarations of secession issued by the states which joined the Confederacy, as well as the Constitution of the Confederacy itself. It's long past time for Congress to reject these symbols of hate and racism that pay tribute to white supremacy and replace them with public monuments that respect and uplift human dignity. I believe Georgia would be much better represented by a statue of Dr. Martin Luther King or Nancy Hart, Mississippi by William Faulkner or Tennessee Williams, Alabama by Jesse Owens or Rosa Parks. I could go on, but I believe the point is clear. There are far more worthy people these states could send to the Capitol than those who fought to preserve slavery and destroy the country. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Senator. The floor remains open for prepared statements. The chair recognizes the senator from Mississippi.
Thank you, Madam President. I share my colleagues' concern over the racial tensions that persist in our country and the dangers of historical amnesia. That said, the bill before us today is not a constructive way to address the problems and may inadvertently make them worse. This bill fails to understand that human beings are incredibly complex and may carry multiple, even contradictory reputations and legacies. While men like Davis, Stephens, and Lee were prominent leaders of the Confederacy, others were ordinary soldiers who made great contributions to the United States later in life. Take, for instance, Edward Douglas White of Louisiana and John Kenna of West Virginia. White went on to serve in the Senate before eventually becoming Chief Justice of the United States, while Kenna, who enlisted when he was only 16, served in both chambers of Congress where he promoted the railroads and coal industry. Do these men's relatively brief service in the Confederacy nullify the remainder of their accomplishments and the contributions they made to the United States later in life? The senator from New Jersey mentioned that these statues should be removed in part because they represent those who defended slavery. If that is the case, then why not remove the statues of all those who did so? Why not remove the statues of Senator John C. Calhoun and President Andrew Jackson? Why not remove the statues of those who owned slaves like George Washington? Is it perhaps because the senator from New Jersey realizes that these men, like those who served in the Confederacy, were more than their worst behaviors and moments? It is important to remember that symbols and their meanings change over time. Likewise, a state's image of itself and its history may also change over time. This is why Congress amended the conditions of the National Statuary Hall collection in 2000 to allow states to remove and replace statues they had previously given. Since then, southern states have responded to this opportunity. In 2009, Alabama replaced the statue of Confederate officer Jabez Curry with Helen Keller. Likewise, in 2016, Florida enacted a law directing the state to find a suitable replacement for Confederate General Edmund Kirby Smith. For the federal government to step in now would be a severe mistake and would risk undoing the hard-won progress being made in the South. As such, I urge my colleagues to join me in voting no on this bill. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Senator. Now, you've heard a statement for the bill and against the bill, and you may have a clear idea of how you would like to vote. If not, that's perfectly fine. We've compiled a little bit of additional information on your profile sheets that you can access and take a look at. Now we've arrived at the part of the program where we open up the floor to our visiting senators to see if you're willing to give us statements for the bill, against the bill, or just about the bill in general. This is genuinely my favorite part of the program, but it's also unfair. In the real Senate, senators have their staff to help them compile statements and help them prepare. And in periods of the Senate's history, senators waited for years before giving their maiden speech on the floor. We're asking you to do it in less than 20 minutes, with little or no preparation. Certainly no statement would need to be as long or well organized as those that you've heard, and we would be delighted to hear any words from our fellow senators. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone. Would any senators be brave enough and gracious enough to give us some words on the bill? Don't be shy. Thank you, Senator. The chair recognizes the senator from the state of? Illinois. Excellent.
Thank you, and I would like to respond to the remarks of my esteemed colleague from the state of Mississippi. It is true that humans are complex, but the...
Did all the...
Hello?
Let's just project. How about you talk loudly? That would be great. Thank you, Senator.
My esteemed colleague. I taught the senator when she was in 9th grade. Still can't believe it. People are complex, and we all represent many things. The display of artwork in the nation's capital displays our national unity and the meaning of what our founding documents are about. They display for all the world to see what it means to be an American. We've reevaluated that over time. We've thought about what it means to be American over time. We're part of a great national tradition of considering what it means to be American now and in continuity with our past. And it's reasonable for societies to consider over time how they've changed and how they can be true to their traditions while being true to the present. And while I admire your respect for the process of southern states as they reevaluate their own legacy, the bill is actually quite limited. The bill is limited to the consideration of public display of art in the nation's capital. States are free to exercise their display of their own state identity in their own states. And so my question for you is it not reasonable to say that despite their complexity, from a national and historical point of view, what makes these people notable in 2018 is that they were members of a society within a society that rebelled against ours. And in order to include all Americans in the vision of what it means to be an American now, we owe it to them, as we owe it to ourselves, to update our national presentation and to ask those states find suitable replacements for the people they have previously, in a different era, chosen to represent us all.
Wow, well, whether you agree or disagree, that was a lovely statement. Thank you, Senator from Illinois. It's almost like you prepared ahead of time. Excellent. Who else would like to speak upon this piece of legislation? Any thoughts? You could even speak from your seats. That's perfectly reasonable. We've heard a little bit of debate here about whether or not the states should be left to make their own decisions, whether the federal government should step in when such progress had been made. Anyone else like to make a statement? Perhaps any of our Southern colleagues here tonight? Excellent. Thank you. Senator from which state?
From the state of Florida.
Florida.
Responding to my esteemed colleague from the state of Illinois, I am proud that the state of Florida has chosen to replace our statue of Edmund Kirby Smith that is currently within the National Statuary Gallery with a statue that is more reflective of our better history, that of Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an African-American philanthropist, educator, and civil rights activist, who also served as an advisor to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I would like to suggest that an attempt to remove all Confederate monuments in one sweeping gesture is a reflection of our current emphasis on political correctness. I think it's important to acknowledge our faults and that we're no longer worshiping these Confederate figures. However, to remove them from history is not doing a service to the African Americans who were oppressed by slavery, nor is it an honest reflection of our own history. Therefore, I would like to oppose this bill. Thank you very much.
Whether you agree or disagree, thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause for the senator from Florida. Would any other senators like to share some of their thoughts, perhaps? Even just how they're feeling they might vote? Perhaps your constituents might like to know how you'd like to go on the record? No? Any other thoughts before we close debate? Oh, fantastic. Senator, which state are you representing today?
South Carolina.
South Carolina, the senator from South Carolina. Chair recognizes the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. I would just like to add a few brief remarks to those of my distinguished colleague from the state of Florida, with whom I wholeheartedly agree. I understand the intent of my esteemed colleague from New Jersey, but I think we should think carefully about what we're about to do before rushing forward. When we look back on the past, we always find that there's never a character from history who is completely morally pure. We have to remember that there's good and bad in so many of our precursors in this great country. And that is true of many of those who are honored with statues here in the United States Capitol. I think we also have to remember something very important about the history of this great country. We had a horrible civil war, the most catastrophic conflict in the country's history. It's the genius of America that we were able to achieve a reconciliation after that war. And part of that process was recognizing that there were great figures on either side of that conflict. And some of those figures served in the Army of the Confederate States of America. They also served, like John C. Calhoun, who's honored with one of the statues sent by the great state of South Carolina, which I represent, as a United States Senator, as a Vice President, as a Secretary of War, as a Secretary of State. He served the Confederacy, perhaps. He did support the Confederate cause, perhaps, but he was a great American in his own right and deserves to be honored. We also should remember that we're a country of great diversity, and respecting the right of each state to express its views, to send its own statute, and not to be subject to the criteria imposed by others is a way we can maintain the diversity of our country and to respect the right of each state. I therefore urge that you vote no on this bill. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Thank you, Senator. Whether, again, you agree, disagree. Applause for the senator from South Carolina. Do we have any further thoughts that we would like to bring to bear before we vote? You're not this shy on the campaign trail. Goodness. Excellent. The chair recognizes the senator from the state of?
West Virginia.
West Virginia.
My state is represented in part by people like John Kenna, who joined the Confederacy at age 16 and was wounded in the line of duty, and he later served as a U.S. representative and a U.S. senator, and also Francis Pierpoint, who was a Unionist, a supporter of Abraham Lincoln, and instrumental to the founding of West Virginia itself. So I can sort of speak from both sides of this argument, and I am cognizant of the fact that in the past, the southern states have considered the Civil War a conflict about states' rights. And to the extent that this bill would be a federal bill that would supersede, so to speak, the rights of the states in this particular kind of situation, I think that's something we need to keep in mind. But at the same time, I also agree with our senator from New Jersey that things do change over time. And I think it would behoove the states involved with the statuary of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, who were basically employed by the Confederacy to be their military leaders and their president. We have to, I think, adjust and presume that there will be other people from those places, from those states, that could be represented in Statuary Hall instead.
Thank you very much, Senator. Again, whether you agree or disagree, applause for the senator from West Virginia. Anybody else? This has been some lively and vigorous debate. Oh, fantastic. Senator, you're from the state of?
Hawaii,
Hawaii.
yes. And coming newly into the nation, we have had our own issues at overcoming racism. And it isn't easy. And anything that does that, that puts it forward, that lessens it, is a plus. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your statements. Again, unless there are any further comments we would like to make, I think it's time to move to a vote. Now, in the regular Senate, we would have a roll call vote where the legislative clerk would read your names and you would respond aye or no, or thumbs up or thumbs down. Now, I'm at a slight disadvantage because I do not know your names and our legislative clerk somehow is not here. So we're going to keep the process brief and do a quick hand vote. Before we do, it's important to remember that senators often have to weigh, balance, and sometimes conflicting interests that they're responsible to represent. This includes, but is not limited to, their party, their state, their own personal beliefs. And if such a conflict might arise for you while you're voting on today's bill, I wish you luck in resolving it in a way that satisfies all of those interests. So we're going to start with the ayes. All those in favor of passing this bill through the Senate, please raise your hand and give us a hearty aye. Aye. All right, let's do it. Whoop, keep it up. I've got to count you. All right. it down so I don't forget. Thank you. Now, all those opposed to the bill, please raise your hands and give us a hearty no.
No.
Speaker. Well, with a vote of 15 to 11, Senate Bill 1772 passes. Congratulations, Senators. This is a momentous achievement. Legislation passes relatively rarely in the Senate. It is not the Senate's job to pass the most bills. It's the Senate's job to pass the best bills that will do the best job and with the least amount of harm. For those of you who voted on the losing side, I want to congratulate you as well. It is not your job to vote with the prevailing opinion, but rather to do what you think is right for your state and for your country. Senators, I want to thank you for coming in tonight to debate and vote on this important piece of legislation. The session is now adjourned. And now I think we have time for a very brief question and answer period led by Dr. Gray. Thank you, Senators.
So as we, before we wrap up the program, do you have any questions for our sitting senators? And, and what took place and the kind of exercise that you just participated. And by the way, thank you for jumping up and giving vigorous floor speeches, or sitting in your chairs and giving vigorous floor speeches. We really appreciate that. But thoughts on this, and any questions for our two senators who gave opened the debate and discussion. But before we move to another part of the program, any thoughts, any comments, any questions from all of you? Thoughts, reactions? Who wants to be a U.S. Senator? Would you like to do that for a day? Yes.
I'm curious for the senators, how did you come to your positions on this?
So, we're in a government class, and we have yes, we're in this government class. We're not in the same class, but we have the same teacher, and we got the opportunity. She asked if anyone wanted to take on this role, and we said we would. So yeah, that's how we got here.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Did performing your roles change your thinking about this issue?
I think definitely for me it was difficult because I personally disagreed with the statement that I read. But it was really interesting. Some of the arguments I really didn't, agree with, like particularly when they were like, oh, all because someone served in the Confederacy doesn't mean I know if I their Jesus later in life, which personally I think supporting slavery is particularly egregious and, shouldn't be in any way acceptable. But when I was thinking about states' rights and that argument, which I didn't talk as much about today, but is definitely also really important to consider, where we draw the line. Does the federal government get to choose what figures states are choosing to represent themselves on a national level? And honestly, it's a little confusing. There's a bit of a gray area there because it shouldn't be up for someone in the north to decide who a southern state wants to be inspired by. So that was definitely really interesting to think about.
Question. Other questions? Okay. Yes.
I came in here with one point of view, on the issues that I read about TV or, I'm sorry. I came in to the debate this evening with one point of view, and
Can I came in with one point of view this evening, informed by reading the paper, watching a little bit of TV, and I couldn't believe it, but I was swayed in a different direction, even though I recognized that somebody could look at my vote. It was shocking to me, but could look at my hand going up, because many people know me in this room, and think that I might be a racist because I voted against this bill.
because I was changed by the statements, my thinking was changed by the statements of the presenters and some of the people in the audience, in that I recognized that that I don't want to have history erased. It's very important to tell the story. And I also think part of the story would play out in a more true way if over time people changed in those individual states. So going to the states' rights argument, if that in fact happened in their state and they changed, then that's a historical event. And then that could be reflected by perhaps their voting over time to change the statutes that represent them. And so then I represent Hawaii. So I didn't represent my state. I forgot to represent my state. So this was a learning experience. It took me back to really me being a young student, maybe even in junior high. I was a senator in Arizona for my junior high. But, you know, I became more formative in allowing myself to feel and think in this way. So, there. Thank you.
Hi, so I think this was a wonderful exercise, and I found that I was thinking not just about federal and states' rights, but also what's happening in our local politics, where we're dealing with some very, I think, tricky, we could call them neighborhood issues and townwide issues, and sometimes they seem to me to be competing interests. And it made me think that maybe this kind of dialogue might be useful just even on a local level to broaden people's minds, to be able to hear other ways of thinking, to, I don't know, for the benefit of the town as a whole. So. Oh.
I feel so often when we see images of the Senate on television, it's a senator speaking to an empty room. And I'm just wondering, how often do senators actually hear each other's statements and take those into account before they make their own statement?
Oftentimes you're right. Senators are speaking to an empty room, but that's not necessarily meaning that no one's listening to them. So everything that is being said in that space is recorded and broadcast out over C-SPAN, and oftentimes everybody else's staff is paying very close attention to what's going on the Senate floor. So, there's a lot that a senator has to juggle, but I think one of the things that we try to emphasize is that it's not the senator alone that is doing the work for the state. It's the very broad staff that also is responding to constituent needs and getting the senator prepared for all of these legislative issues that are coming up. And so, yes, it does appear that way, but I think that it's not too far from most people's consciousnesses.
And if you walk into Senate offices, you'll find the TV on where this is happening real time, so that they're watching and then figuring out, do I need to get down there? How do I respond? What's happening in that moment? But there are times when you think, where is everybody? And I think clearly depending upon what else is happening on a legislative agenda too. But you're right, it's a big space and sometimes it does look quite empty.
But isn't something lost by them not being in the same room to hear each other and respond?
Yeah, I would think so, but also one of the things that we know, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, is that so much of the work of getting to the decision-making and the compromise happens outside of that space. Sometimes that's a space to put the finishing cap, or maybe convince a few more, or articulate something that you think is important for the country to understand. But so much is happening outside of that room to get to that point. So I think that that's the piece. It's almost sometimes more important that what's happening at the smaller tables, to get them into those rooms to have more rigorous, thoughtful discussions where we can listen to one another. And that's the hope that we have. We know it isn't working perfectly, but that's the hope that we have. Any more questions on the exercise? We'll take one more.
I don't know if this is on the exercise, but this is the general idea of, just from what you said, how much is there talking to people who don't agree with you in the House and Senate now? I don't know if you have any idea. I want to also talk to that comment about erasing history. When you're removing Confederate statues, you're actually raising an issue and you're amplifying the history. You're not erasing it. You're not replacing it. You're making it richer and broader. But
Sure.
nevertheless,
Well, I'll dodge one part of your question and try to answer the other. And because I'll get to the issue of just debate and discussion and building community in a moment. But having spent several years as a chancellor in the southern part of the country, one of the areas that we had a lot of talk about was this issue about history. How do we recognize it? How do we understand it? How do we not erase it? How do we appreciate all the parts of it? And I think that you raise a very important point, that it is important to have these conversations, that we have to look at what's happening present, because if we don't understand our history, we're doomed to make the same mistakes as we go forward. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we teach on this, and then where are the points where it really is something that we have to take a stand and say, we have to teach about this, we have to talk about it, but we have to change these symbols, because the symbols are creating hurt to a whole new generation. So, but it does amplify it and gives us a renewed opportunity, we hope, to have the kind of conversation to understand that part of our past so we can do better in the future. But if we don't create these spaces to have these kind of conversations, things can get out of control. So I think when I look at the work of the Institute and how we create a climate to bring people together, I mean, you saw our fabulous students, so I want to just take a moment and, if we can, thank our 2 senators for giving their maiden speeches on the Senate floor. Yeah, and to thank our presiding officer. She was, deputized to be vice president tonight, and I want to thank all of you for stepping into that. You can see what happens, right? You warm up a little bit, and then you begin to step into the role, and that's what we're working on every day. And think about it, you have a lot of experience with the democratic process. You engage, you're part of your community. When we're trying to bring in a group of students or people who may not be as active, these tools are useful to get them to step into and to feel that they can have these conversations in a way where they're finding their voice. And when you present a point of view that maybe you don't, as you so articulated beautifully, you may not agree with, but you found yourself listening to it, and is there something here I'm missing? And I think that's the part of the human condition we all have to be willing to accept is, are we missing something? And should we at least not stop to listen to that person who may have a very different perspective? Because we could gain something from those interactions. So when I started my conversation earlier about being hopeful about our future, I think Cassie and Callie just indicated for me and all of us why I feel that hope. So thank you again for being such great leaders. And they are seniors in high school, and I was talking with them earlier about their college pathway, and it's going to be fabulous and fantastic. So I can't wait as a recovering college president to see what you do next. So thank you for that. You inspire me just by being here with all of you, so I appreciate that. And all of you for jumping into it. The interactive programs, Caroline mentioned this, and this was role-playing. So I'm also mindful that we're on cable TV, so if anyone's tuning in at home and catching little snippets of this, everybody in the room was playing a role to entice debate and discussion. That's what we have to do. We have to listen to one another. And so we do this at the Kennedy Institute every day with school groups coming through, and it is really remarkable to see what they do as we encourage this level of discussion. We have to listen to one another. We need to consider the other opinion, even when we don't agree with it. I can't tell you right now how much it's hurting me to think about the New York Yankees, when I am a rabid Red Sox fan. So, we have to be hanging on to these moments, because that helps us bring stronger communities and healthier democracies. Over the summer, as we think about the points that we hear, we conducted a national poll. It's the 3rd annual poll we've done on civic engagement. And we partnered with 2 leading polling firms, one Republican and one Democratic, so we could bring in a broad perspective. We wanted to understand what's happening in the country. We wanted to understand what voters think about the United States Senate. And so this bipartisan survey, we got the results from, and we found, and this is not going to come as a surprise to many of you, that the result underscores that there is indeed a disconnect between what voters want and what they're seeing happen in their elected offices, particularly with the U.S. Senate. We heard from those survey respondents that what they wanted in their United States senators was someone who would be willing to listen, and really listen, as you all did here tonight. But we also found from the majority of voters who responded that they felt that their typical senator was not in touch with what they cared about, that there was that disconnect. Many of the voters said that they would like to see greater compromisers. They would like to see senators working together to solve common problems, but that they don't see that happening in the current environment. And we found, and this was regardless of party affiliation, that satisfaction across the board with what's happening is low. Again, it's no surprise to folks in this room. We also found at the same time that within the face of this dissatisfaction, that many of the voters who responded to the survey lacked a basic understanding of what went on in their own democracy. They lacked facts about the United States Senate. For example, they didn't know how long a senator's term might be, or how many senators there are from each state, or even who their own United States senator is. They didn't maybe even know that there might be an election happening in their state. So we find dissatisfaction, yet a disconnection from what is actually happening. No doubt our elected leaders need to do better, no doubt about that, but so do we as engaged citizens. The answer to this frustration and anger that many of us feel some days is to engage, not to withdraw. It's what the Brookline League of Women Voters does every day. It's at the core of your mission. Our poll results confirmed for us that regardless of party affiliations, Americans want their elected leaders to work together. Earlier I mentioned Senator John McCain and how we opened up the doors the day of his funeral. And during the services and all the days leading up to it, we heard many accounts of how Senator McCain reached across the aisle and worked with us. And we heard many accounts about how he did that particularly well with Senator Kennedy. And we found ourselves with these two different senators from different states, different parties, different viewpoints, who shared a commitment to the people that they served, a love of their country, a passion for the work of the Senate. Senator Kennedy was passionate about the work of the Senate, and a common call to service. They reminded us of what can happen when we really work together. And in their absence, we're reminded of what happens when we don't work together. In this political climate, it is incumbent upon all of us to pick up the mantle, pick up that torch. This work, the work that all of you are doing in this room, just coming here tonight, the work that our students are doing, the learning that's taking place in the classroom, it's urgent and it all matters. It all matters. I had the privilege when I was a college president of awarding Senator Kennedy an honorary degree. He spoke that day to my students and their families and the community about the importance of civic engagement and the power that we have to make a difference. He encouraged them to get involved, to take the long view, to realize things don't happen overnight, that you have to stay in the conversation, stay in the struggle, and his words ring true today. And at the Institute, that's what we focus on every day, and we really believe that broadening civic education, creating spaces, and sometimes we will, here we brought the space to you, we worked here with all of you tonight. It's about giving people the tools to have these conversations so we can be more responsive and more inclusive, because that's what's going to help our democracy more than anything. Across the country and here in Massachusetts, we should be very proud in Massachusetts that Massachusetts is prioritizing civics education, making sure it works its way back into the curriculum. It has support from the legislature, from the governor. There are still things to be worked out, but Massachusetts is leading the way in making sure that this is something that we're teaching in our classrooms so that you go out to the community informed. And while engaging youth is paramount, we know that we have to focus on what we identify as the democracy gap, that citizens of all ages need to learn more about what happens in their democracy and what their roles and responsibilities are. We know that there are multiple generations of individuals who are registered to vote that lack those basic facts, and that's where you come in so beautifully, and we're grateful to the work that the League of Women Voters does in this regard. And we are making progress, and we have to be hopeful on that. We have to broaden and deepen the conversations. We have to create more tables. We have to look at the diversity around those tables. Who's in the conversation matters to how those conversations turn out. We need to be having discussions just like this, students with teachers, parents with children, neighbors with neighbors, colleagues with colleagues, and this has to happen across party lines and regardless of political affiliation. And that's what we do every day at the Institute. And I'll share one vignette with you as I was beginning my time at the Institute. We had a group of students from one of the Boston public schools, and they were debating immigration reform. Very complex, very timely, very real to the students in that room. And what I saw was a moment where we had to take that time to listen to one another. For those students who, for them, this was more than an academic exercise, it was more than an intellectual exercise. It was the life that they're leading every day, about the world that's changing right around them, and how in that space, the tools that will empower them to know that they can make a difference is so important, because that's our future. So when I think about taking the exercise here, creating a place that's safe, where empathy can be practiced, where we can listen to one another and where we can gain from that experience, that's what we're doing every day at the Kennedy Institute, and that is so important, and that's what you're doing when you're trying to bring people in to the democratic process. And so we have to listen and we have to learn from one another, and that's how we'll do our best differences. You know, Senator Kennedy really believed that you do not have to leave your principles at the door to engage in real compromise, but we have to get through the door, we have to listen to one another, and we have to be willing to engage in those debates. And that's what we're doing at the Institute. And I really hope that tonight's exercise shows you a little bit about some of how we're teaching, some of how we're engaging, some of how we're bringing in, in these programs to open up discussions, to be able to teach people about how our government works, but also about what's our important role as citizens in that government, to engage with one another, to stay with those conversations, and to work to strengthen communities. And that's why what you're doing is so important. Community organizations like this and others are what make all the difference. And community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood is how we will do some of our best work. And that's where the hope comes in, because aggregating that work, to the state level, to the national level, will help us make our difference. And we need everybody right now to be working on these issues collectively. So to have some time with you tonight to talk a little bit about the Institute, to talk about civic engagement, to talk about how we're working with students, and to talk about our democratic process is inspiring for us. And to know that you're out there doing this work is inspiring for us, because we have partners in this work, and we so appreciate the leadership that comes from this room. 75 years of leadership, almost 100 years across the country, and we thank you for that and for the opportunity to be with you this evening. And I don't know if anybody has any final questions. Yes?
Would you be able to comment or willing to comment on what happened to civics courses? I'm remembering now as we sit here that I think I was a junior in high school and we had to take American history. It wasn't like some fringe course, it was just one of the history courses, and we had to memorize and learn all of those facts, but I became very interested in government at that point.
Yes. Yeah, it's
And a supporter of democracy and voting and.
absolutely.
If we don't have that engagement, no wonder people are like mad that they're not, the young people.
That's right. Well, and it's an excellent point, and I'm not sure at what point we stopped teaching it, because I remember taking those classes too. But at some point, it just wasn't prevalent in the curriculum. And as schools across the country, looking at other priorities that were coming forward, things they had to teach to, things they had to respond to, I think it just began to slide away. Some schools, some states, some communities always have prioritized it. I mean, even before this push to make civics legislation happen, there are some schools across the Commonwealth doing spectacular work because they consider this to be important. But you can see what happens across the country when we stop teaching about these things. We stop teaching about the fundamentals of how our government works. We stop teaching about our role in that democracy, because without that knowledge, you may not know exactly what you can do to influence the process, that you have a voice, that there are elected representatives that you send to office, that, that there are ways bills get developed and legislation gets passed, and there are all these rules that influence the process, and that we are not without voice and without influence and without power, but you can forget about that and leave it to others. So teaching it is so important, and having students absorb it so that they have not just the passion and the concern, but the language and the knowledge base for how it works is important. So in Massachusetts and across the country, there's a movement to restore it. Massachusetts, we're returning it into some of the curriculum standards at different grade levels. There is a piece of legislation that would have it be a mandatory piece of the education curriculum. That is presently continuing to be worked out, but it is being built into the curriculum standards at certain grade levels, and we're working with schools across the Commonwealth right now on how to teach that, how we can be part of that interactive piece of teaching it, because we have to, because that's contributed to the knowledge gap in significant ways. If you don't know how your government works, it is sometimes puzzling to think about how you really interact with it. And then it gives you, you know, the opportunity to kind of step back from it. And that's not right either. People need to step into it. Yes.
Just a quick question. We're very privileged to live in Massachusetts and to have the history of forming the nation here, and institutes like the Kennedy Institute, which totally invigorated both of my sons to, you know, watching the Lincoln on President's Day, which one of the days we visited. So it was a great way for them, after living outside of the United States for a while, to really kind of get indoctrinated in what it means to be an American and our institution. How do we duplicate that across the nation? Is there any effort? Are there any thoughts in mind? Because changing the education system is very slow and takes a long time. But how do we make this part of our permanent, I guess, American culture across multiple states, so that immigrants, visitors, people that come to the United States can learn about our politics and how it works and its dysfunction and functionality,
Right.
And then how to be engaged, you know, how to register a vote, how to register others to vote, all of those things. I'm just curious if there's any thought to little miniature Kennedy Institute.
Sure, that's right.
By some other name, maybe.
Right. Well,
with that model of education.
yeah, it was, I'll summarize because it's a great question with lots of parts, but the question, and you can correct me if I don't get it right, is that it was about how do we take that in Massachusetts we have, you know, this is kind of in our culture to teach these things. How do we take what we're doing here and spread it across the country? Because not every state works in the same way. There are new, you know, immigrants coming to the country that may need a pathway to learn more about it. It's that mobilization in some ways. Is that kind of a short? And so how do we do that? And so first of all, that's when I say about hope, is that you know, having spent a lot of time in the last several years on college campuses across the country, I'm absolutely hopeful about the level of energy and intelligence and invigoration that's happening on our college campuses with students who are coming up, who are getting involved and engaged in the process. You know, there's no doubt about it. They're paying attention. And then what they have to do is learn how to step into the process. There's a movement across the country, much of it driven by organizations like Leagues of Women Voters, to get others to consider running for office. Forget about party affiliation, but let's figure out how you run, let's figure out how you get involved, and helping with that, because it's a mystery. You know, most people don't just get up in the morning and say, gosh golly, I'm going to run for the U.S. Senate. Some people might, but it takes some convincing and some organizing. So that's one way that's happening. And then, when I think about the work that we're doing, we actually are involved in a process of taking some of our curriculum and looking at how we take it and work with other centers and institutes similar to us across the country. Who are those partners? Nonpartisan, bipartisan partners across the country that may have institutes embedded in other places, congressional centers, legislative centers. There's also the work that organizations like iCivics are involved in, where they're pushing out curriculum. There are Campus Compact is another organization. So there are organizations out there. There are teachers, there are students, there are community groups, and what we have to do is just keep linking on those. So we're in the process right now, we've been open for 3.5 years, looking at how we take our best practices, we can bring those to places, learn from those other places, because we can't pretend to have all the answers, but to tap into those efforts to engage that are happening across the country, because it is happening. And I think that is very encouraging. And when I look at campuses, the campus that I led in North Carolina had the highest rate of voter registration in the state of North Carolina, and we were the liberal arts university for the state of North Carolina. So students are paying attention and they're realizing that voting matters. So I think it's going to take all of us continuing to work on it, and if we have a good idea, figure out how we push out that good idea, and to make sure when we're creating those tables for conversations, we're bringing in other voices and not just listening to those who think just like us. But there is work happening, and it has to keep happening more and more. And thank you for raising that question. Thank you for coming to the Institute. That's awesome. Yes. Well, let's go to one of our student senators, and then we'll go to the back of the room. Yes.
I just had a question about the bill that you had mentioned previously that's working its way through the Massachusetts legislature, because I know right now students are required to take United States history their junior year, but I feel very strongly also that all students should be required to take Gov. And so my question was, is that what that bill aims to do, is to incorporate government curriculum into required curriculum?
Yeah, I think, Caroline, can you answer that?
Absolutely.
I might just, you know.
Sure. So the question was about what exactly that piece of legislation entails and is addressing that's making its way through Massachusetts legislature. Sorry. So actually what happened at the end of the last semester is sort of two things. One is that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education proposed and was accepted by the board that there be new standards put in place in Massachusetts that requires, that requires that civics be integrated into K through 12 curriculum across the board. So that's basically saying that all teachers at all grade levels need to be thinking about how they're talking about civics, how they're integrating it, but with a particular focus on 8th grade, and also looking at a government class in high school. Now, the legislation is supporting those standards in addition to suggesting that it's not just about learning civic knowledge, it's also about civic practices. And so it's proposing that there be projects that students are encouraged to do that help them to take that knowledge and put it into practice so that they're gaining the skills at the same time as they are the knowledge, and creating hopefully civic dispositions, which is sort of this idea that if you practice doing this work, it will become part of you and part of sort of how you will, continue to engage when you leave school. So does that answer your question?
Now, we had a question in the back row.
I wonder if you would give a comment on this civility of discourse. We talked about the marvelous, I think I have a loud enough voice, but that's all right. I wonder if you could comment on the civility, the quality of civil discourse. It sounds like you have a tremendous program, a civics program, but in your research, in your observations of the Senate, the National Senate, as well as perhaps state senates, and with the students, and I assume you also facilitate groups of adults. I wonder if you could comment on whether you have seen any changes in the quality of the discussions.
Sure. That's an excellent question, and doing it in the way with role playing and modeling is to try to introduce, as having led a couple of liberal arts universities, you hear the word soft skills when people talk about communication, listening, debate. I consider those hard skills. Those are the qualities and the skills that we need to separate ourselves. So when you think about taking that moment, because the way the rules of engagement are set up, to stop and listen, that's helpful, rather than rushing right into the next question or saying, I disagree with you, without stopping. So even sometimes teaching those skills, which we can forget to have. So that's part of what we do. And I'll give you an example of what I saw happen one day with a group, not students coming in, but it was a Saturday program, and we were open, and so we had a chamber program. It was a today's vote. I don't quite recall the topic, but I was lurking in the back of the chamber, as I can sometimes do. And a group came in, and they were different family groups. They didn't know each other coming in. There was family A, we will call them, the Smiths, the Jones, and the Robertsons, perhaps. And they came in, 3 different families on a Saturday, parental types, adults, kids, and they were different demographics, looked to appear to be diverse. And they came in, and they didn't know each other coming in, except for the groups that had come in together. So we began the efforts, the work of introducing a bill, getting them to take on the role. Now, they were total strangers, other than the families they had traveled with. And during the course of this time together, what I saw was really, really interesting, was that as they had to stop and listen to one another, because there was a presiding officer and they were taking questions, these families that didn't know each other were suddenly listening, and they took different positions, like all of you were so gracious to do here, even if you maybe didn't agree, and they were taking a position. And so others, even within their own families, were now listening to them differently because they had been assigned different perspectives. So I was watching a parent listen to a child, and a child listen to a parent, and adults from different family constellations listening to one another. And they were getting up and they were using some of the language here. My colleague from Massachusetts, my colleague from New Hampshire, and maybe there was even an esteemed colleague thrown in there just to make home a point. But at the end of it, when the legislation was being voted on, and the bill, I don't recall if it went down to defeat or it passed, what happened next was really the thing that was most inspiring. Was that the program was over, the Senate was, was changing gears, and this group that came in, not knowing each other, was now standing there talking to one another, introducing themselves to each other. I was watching the parents having a different kind of conversation with the child they were traveling with, like maybe didn't realize you had all those thoughts or questions, or the child listening to the parent, like that was pretty thoughtful what you had to say. But I was struck by this group of strangers when they came in the door, and in that moment, they worked and got to know each other a little bit better. And that's part of what we have to do to restore the civility, is to recreate those opportunities for community. And they aren't always natural, they don't always happen easily, but when they happen, they're special, and you have to hang on to it. So, again, those glimmers of hope, but we have to hold ourselves accountable when people don't do it that well, and not let it slip by. Great question, thank you. Any other questions? I have to recognize my colleague in the back of the room, Len Palillo, who was one of my faculty members at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mary. Incredible person. I was at MCLA for about 32 years. The last 10 were my best because she was my president, so it was wonderful. But anyway, I just, sorry I missed earlier part. It sounded like fabulous stuff. I was just teaching my one course at Bridgewater State University, which Mary helped me get when I retired from North Adams. But anyway, just hearing you right now, I read an awful article yesterday by Ezra Klein in Vox. I don't know. The rigging of American politics. Political systems depend on legitimacy. In America, that legitimacy is failing. Thank God, I was so depressed after I read that article. Hearing you tonight and hearing what you do at the Institute is the kind of thing people have to recognize that our government is legitimate and that our systems are legit. If they don't do that, I mean, says in there that, people, you could have violence, you could have all kinds of things. So it's not so much a question, but just keep up the great work that you do, and I'm so proud to have had you as a student.
Thank you, Len. Great. And I think that maybe is a great comment to wrap up on. We have, I'd like to just share with you a brief video. It's really brief, but it will give you one more window into what we have every day at the Institute. And I want to thank all of you and invite you to come and be a part of it if you haven't. And to our student senators, thank you again, you are awesome. And when you run for office, we're all going to work on your campaigns. So a little vignette and closing with the words of a voice I think many of you in this room will find familiar. So thank you for your time, really appreciate it, and thank you for the work that you do to make our democracy better and healthier. Thanks. Miles is on cue.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Senate chamber here at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate.
The Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate is dedicated to educating the public about the important role of the Senate in government, encouraging civic participation, and invigorating civil discourse. Innovative and nationally recognized educational programs provide a high-tech and hands-on learning experience that teaches the next generation how our government works and the skills of listening, compromise, and healthy debate that are needed to productively participate in our democracy.
My students really liked being able to have their opinion heard, and they all had very strong opinions. And so they really wanted to let everyone know what they thought and to debate the issue.
Visitors step into the shoes of a U.S. Senator for a day, and with a handheld tablet and skilled facilitators serving as guides, explore exhibits and daily interactive programs that weave together the history and current debates of the U.S. Senate, Senator Kennedy's legacy of service, and a call for visitors to engage in their own communities.
This place really stands out for the fact that students are actually involved. They're using technology, using the tablets. There is an opportunity for them to be in the Senate chamber. They're not going to see that anywhere else.
Public programs bring together diverse leaders for engaging and bipartisan conversations that address critical issues facing our state, our nation, and the world. The Institute is a true hub for civic education and engagement for Massachusetts and the nation.
Yes, we are all Americans. This is what we do. We reach the moon. We scale the heights. I know it. I've seen it. I've lived it. And we can do it again. There is a new wave of change all around us. And if we set our compass true, we will reach our destination.
Okay, well, this wraps us up, but we're not quite finished yet, folks, so hang on for one more minute. I just want to thank all of the players, the senators and their colleagues for their participation. But I also want to give a gift to the Institute. And this is really in thanks, but also something that I think is appropriate. It's a book called The Woman's Hour, and it's about the League of Women Voters, actually the beginning of the League of Women Voters. It's really about the campaign for the passage of the 19th Amendment, actually for the state of Tennessee to vote to support the constitutional amendment. And it's a great book, and I happen to enjoy it myself, but I also think it's an appropriate thing to be at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. So please enjoy that and share it. Thank you very much. Very happy for you to take it. I feel I have to apologize for our lack of technological success tonight. I really regret that we had difficulties, and I have to say that because of misunderstandings, the entire program was probably not all taped. I think they started with the role playing. I think they got that, but I don't think they got prior to that. So I'm hoping, in any case, if it was successfully taped, it will be available through, eventually it'll be put up by the local access television program. And what I really wanted was to be able to share this, because I thought it was such a great program, and everything that everybody had to say enhanced it. And I'm deeply regretful that we didn't have it pulled off the way we had hoped it would be. And I'm just going to end on one sort of, this is a personal anecdote, but I feel like it's appropriate. I got my start, so to speak, in political civic engagement as a high school senior in Texas. I am a Southerner. And at that moment in time, there was a very hot primary underway between Lyndon Baines Johnson and John F. Kennedy. My high school held a mock election. I happened to serve as a participant on the local debate team, and we debate members drew straws to select a candidate for whom we would then campaign. And the important end of this story is that in Texas, the home state of one of the primary candidates, my high school in a small southeast Texas town, city, voted for John F. Kennedy. And all came about because we did exactly what was being illustrated. We had a huge and vigorous public discussion and debate, and everybody had something to say about it. And people actually changed their views. And that, I think, is why civic education is so important and civic engagement is so important. And on that note, thank you all and good night.